Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Burr, Cantwell, Collins, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Heinrich, Kelly, Lujan, Manchin, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Schatz, Shaheen, Smith, Warner, Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Graham, Marshall, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Young. Mr. Chester, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Miss Cinema, Miss Cinema, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Inhofe, no.
Oh yeah, I know. I mean, we ran out of places to put snow. Like when I was home over the weekend.
Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye.
Yeah, me too. I'm like,
Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Miss Lummis, no.
just the movement of the vehicle, and it just they got so sick.
Miss Baldwin, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Carper, aye.
Just like so many cries about everything. Oh, I remember that.
Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Carden. Mr. Carden, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, No. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Miss Ernst, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Miss Stabenow, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Miss Klobuchar, aye. Miss Rosen, aye. Mr. Haggerty, Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Rish, Mr. Rish, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Thank you. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. No.
On this vote, the yeas are 64, the nays are 33. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on Executive Calendar Number 8, Gina Marie Raimondo of Rhode Island to be Secretary of Commerce, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Gina Marie Raimondo of Rhode Island to be Secretary of Commerce shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under rule. Under the rule, the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hassan, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Leahy, Lee, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Marshall, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Schatz, Shaheen, Cinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Tillis, Toomey, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Sanders, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Cotton, Cruz, Haggerty, Hawley, Kennedy, Lummis, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Shelby, and Tuberville. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Sass, Mr. Sass. No.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 84, the nays are 15, and the motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Gina Marie Raimondo of Rhode Island to be secretary.
Mr. President,
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 82 submitted earlier today.
Senate will be in order, please. Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 82, honoring the life and legacy of John Robert Lewis and commending John Robert Lewis for his towering achievements in the nonviolent struggle for civil rights.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I yield.
Mr. President,
From Iowa.
Mr. President, from the streets of Portland and Seattle to right here in our nation's capital, lawlessness has ensued all too often across our nation over the past year. I have consistently called it what it is, anarchy. And folks, we need to be absolutely clear on this. Anarchy cannot be tolerated in our nation. The mayhem that we have seen over the last year has put our families, our communities, and our law enforcement in danger. And tragically, it has led to death and destruction. In what will probably come as no shock to the American people, a nonpartisan watchdog organization found that the federal government has spent more than $14 billion of our taxpayer money, our hard-earned dollars, on federal contracts and grants in 5 major cities where civil unrest, also known as anarchy, goes unchecked and police are unable to do their job. $14 billion with a B dollars paid to local leaders and city officials who are failing to do their jobs. And let's keep talking about these dollar figures, folks. According to recent reports by local media in Oregon, left-wing protests in Portland have caused roughly $2.3 million in damage to federal buildings since they broke out last summer. The near nightly standoffs with police involved graffiti, broken windows, firecrackers, as well as Molotov cocktails. According to one U.S. attorney in Oregon, cleanup at the courthouse and 4 other government buildings has cost more than $2 million, And that number could keep going up because the repairs are ongoing. Last year, I pushed for a review of any federal funding that was going to the cities and states that were allowing anarchy to run rampant. It was a simple ask: scrutinize any future federal funding that might flow into these lawless jurisdictions. Specifically, I asked the Office of Management and Budget to look into and report to the American people the amount of taxpayer dollars local officials use to either sustain these autonomous zones or the amount needed to repair the damage done during the chaos. And thankfully, last year, the federal government began to do just that. But folks, just last week, President Biden reversed this effort, and I'd like to know why. Now, I agree with our new president that peaceful protests are a cornerstone of our democracy. But smashing windows is not protesting, and neither is looting. Burning small businesses that are the modest nest eggs of hardworking Americans, and actions like these are totally unacceptable. I don't think there's anyone in the Senate that would disagree. So why then is President Biden reversing course and preventing this review from going forward? To simply examine the funds that are going to the very places where lawlessness continues to be unanswered. Too often over the last year, local leaders have prevented law enforcement and emergency responders from being allowed to carry out their jobs and protect the public. Yet millions of our taxpayer dollars have still been doled out to these cities. I will continue to stand strong and be a voice for the hardworking taxpayers of this country. If city and state leaders abdicate their job to protect citizens and allow anarchist jurisdictions to prevail, the federal government, Iowa taxpayers, should absolutely not foot the bill. Anarchy is never okay, never okay. And taxpayers should never subsidize it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Minnesota.
as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res 83 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 83 expressing support for the designation of February 20 through February 27, 2021 as National FFA Week and so forth.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it recesses until 10:30 a.m. on Tuesday, March 2nd, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Raimondo nomination. That at 2:15 p.m., the cloture time be considered expired, and the Senate vote on confirmation of the nomination. That if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action. And finally, that Senator Cruz be recognized at 12:15 p.m. for up to 30 minutes, and following his remarks, the Senate recesses until 2:15 p.m. for the weekly conference meetings.
Is there objection? Without objection.
For the information of senators, there will be two roll call votes at 2:15 p.m. The first vote will be on confirmation of the Raimondo nomination to be Secretary of Commerce, followed by a cloture vote on the Rouse nomination to be Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it recess under the previous order.
10:30 a.m.
Senate stands in recess until 10:30 a.m. tomorrow.